the diggers, Abby Hoffman with the yippies. A number of people talked about the end of scarcity and the idea, let the machines do it. That cybernetics, that technology could replace alienating labor, and that as human beings, we should reap the rewards of all that, to have a super partying, psychedelic, liberatory experience in life.
Hello, and welcome to the fourth installment of the KMO Show. I'm your host, KMO, and in this episode of the podcast, I have a conversation that I recorded a couple of weeks ago with Ken Goffman, better known as Are You Sirius? And it just so happens that today I have been granted access to Bard, which is Google's answer to Microsoft and OpenAI's, what are they calling it? Bing/Sydney, which is basically a large language model, which, some people call an AI. And you can ask it questions. You can ask it to generate text. So I asked it, compare Mondo2000 magazine with Wired magazine. And this is what Bard said. Mondo2000 and Wired were both magazines that cover technology and culture, but they have different approaches. Mondo2000 was more anarchic and subversive, while Wired is more mainstream and polished. Mondo2000 was also more focused on the underground and counterculture, while Wired is more focused on the mainstream and the emerging. Mondo2000 was founded in 1989 by Ken Goffman and Jude Milhon, aka Are You Sirius and St. Jude. Bard didn't provide that, that was me. Bard continues, who were both part of the cyberpunk movement. The magazine was originally called Reality Hackers, but it was renamed Mondo2000 in 1989. Mondo2000 covered a wide range of topics, including virtual reality, smart drugs, and weird bands. It was known for its psychedelic and anarchic style. Wired was founded in 1993 by Louis Rossetto and Jane Metcalf. The magazine was originally called Wired News, but it was renamed Wired in 1994. Wired covers a wide range of topics, including technology, culture, and business. It is known for its mainstream and polished style. Mondo2000 folded in 1999. Actually, it's 1998, while Wired is still in publication today. Both magazines have had a significant impact on the way we think about technology and culture. So, I guess that's a good enough introduction. Here's my conversation with Are You Sirius? I am KMO. We're recording for the KMO Show, and I'm here with Are You Sirius? Hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Yeah.
This is our second conversation. Our first was a few years ago, and it was for a live radio show, and I don't remember what we talked about, and that show is not archived.
Yeah, I think I was drawing attention to a particular song called President Mussolini Makes the Planes Run on Time.
Uh-huh.
And I think it revolved around that particular song by a band called Party Dogs that was remixed by a band called Friends at that time. It was originally for the Ronald Reagan era. Reagan, at the beginning of his term, fired the the people, the air controllers.
Right.
That control flights. It's kind of the first salvo of anti-union activism, along with Margaret Thatcher. So I wrote a song called President Mussolini Makes the Planes Run on Time that reflected on his attitude towards air controls, which is now an issue again.
With the trains.
Yeah, trains and planes now are both messing up. So, one of the problems of decentralization and deconstruction of the federal government, one of the nuances of a complicated period in which we're trying to figure out how to cope with new technology and yeah, I guess everything else we could possibly think of.
Well, yours is a name that I associate with Mondo2000 magazine. Yeah. And the early days of the World Wide Web, and even before the web, the various incarnations of the internet that preceded the World Wide Web, like Usenet and Internet Relay Chat and things like that.
The well.
And what?
The well.
Oh, the well, the whole Earth electronic link. Yes.
That was the place. I think I started there in 1990, actually. Although St. Jude, who the only woman in the original Hackers book by Stephen Levy, was trying to get me into social networks. What did we call them back then? Bulletin boards. Even back before that, in the late 1980s. She also dragged me to a rave in the late 1980s. Who knew there would be raves? It was all gay at that time in San Francisco. As far as I know. Anyway.
Wow. As I say, I remember your work largely from the 1990s. And when I was in Japan in the early 90s, like 93, 94, I remember I had with me a copy of the book. I have it up here on Amazon. Mondo2000, A User's Guide to the New Edge, Cyberpunk, Virtual Reality, Wetware, Designer Aphrodisiacs, Artificial Life, Techno-Erotic Paganism, and then there's not room for the full title. So I don't know what came after that. That was published in 1992.
Yes.
Yeah.
I recall being on tour for it in 1993, but I guess it was officially in 1992, sure. Yeah, as I was on tour in New York City, I learned that we were going to be featured in a Time magazine cover story that year. So it was kind of the last glory moment of Mondo2000, really, 1993. It did peter on for a few more years after that. Yeah.
Well, the period where you describe it as petering on, I remember that magazine as being it was beautifully designed. It was high quality, like a fashion magazine, but sort of a high art fashion magazine, but dealing with the types of topics that I was just listing in the title of the book.
Yeah.
So I think about authors like Bruce Sterling and Terence McKenna, and who else from that period?
John Shirley, Rudy Rucker.
Right. Yes.
Timothy Leary was a regular writer for us. Yeah, there are so many people whose names might not be as well known or might not have been as well known then. Mark Derry used to write wonderful columns for us, very widely known and respected writer today. God, who can remember?
Well, you've written a book about that period, and I was just reading, I'm afraid I didn't get to the chapters you sent to me until just a few minutes ago, so I've just read a few paragraphs, but you start off talking about how it's something I assume, I associate with the 1990s, but you say that what would become the publishing empire of Mondo2000 started in 1984, which I was 16 at the time. I was certainly unaware of it. But then you say, really, this all flowed out of the 1960s. So I would invite you to go back and talk about your experience of the 1960s and the different trends and currents and people that eventually led to what we would later know as Mondo2000.
Yeah, I mean, in the late 1960s, I was in high school. And there seemed to be a revolution happening. It sort of happened and it sort of fizzled, depending on how you interpret it. But there was this idea floating around at that time in the late 60s, propagated largely by the group The Diggers, they were an anarchist collective in San Francisco and New York City that used to run a free store and allow people to bring stuff in to give away, and then people would take stuff out. There's a version of that going around now, actually, and much more formal and well run. I'm sure. I'd have to look it up to see where and what that is. But the Diggers, Abby Hoffman with the Yippies, a number of people talked about the end of scarcity and the idea, let the machines do it, that cybernetics, that technology could replace alienating labor, and that as human beings, we should reap the rewards of all that, to have a super partying, psychedelic, liberatory experience in life. So that was one of the ideas going around in the late 1960s. Stuart Brand, who would end up being one of the main proponents of the new digital culture and who created the first hackers conference in 1984, was also on top of that notion and started the whole idea of tools for living with the Whole Earth catalog. Also during that period, William Burroughs was another proponent of post-scarcity. I mean, there was a lot of that kind of stuff around. So I opened the book. One of the things I opened the book with is a memory of my experience going to see the Living Theater, Julian Beck and the Living Theater in Ithaca, not far from where I grew up, I think in 1968. And it was a fabulous performance, but it was a litany of complaints about things you cannot do. I can't take my clothes off. I can't smoke marijuana. I can't cross borders without a passport. I thought that was very 1960s and not very 21st century, where people are much more concerned with stopping people from doing things that they shouldn't do. But at that time, it was very dynamic, and everybody took their clothes off in the audience. One of the things that happened is the actors would run off the stage, grab people by their arms, and lift them up to their feet if they were just sitting around, which people interpreted as liberatory at the time, but probably would interpret as abuse today. So the culture has changed quite a lot since that time. But Mondo in the 90s and High Frontiers, Reality Hackers in the 1980s were sort of dragging that feeling of the end of boundaries and of the liberatory possibilities of technology associated with counterculture, that it could create something phenomenal and fantastic, and maybe mutate and take over the world, to borrow the title of a book I wrote with St. Jude Milhan. So I hope that in some scrambled way helps to elucidate how I was dragging the 60s into the 80s and 90s. High Frontiers was 1984. That's where it started. A lot of my friends in the Bay Area will remember High Frontiers. It actually got to about 18,000 distribution, which was, we were kind of superstars in the zine scene already. Became Reality Hackers, which was less popular than High Frontiers, and then eventually became Mondo2000, which had some degree of commercial success and distribution and so forth.
Well, you have been watching the trends that are of interest to me for about my entire life. You know, I didn't get interested in them until my early 20s. You know, I was born in 68, and by 68, you were already, tuned into a lot of the things that are of great interest to me now. I want to focus on the slogan, let the machines do it. Because we're in a period where artificial intelligence, after having, been this overhyped technology that didn't really do a whole lot for a very long time, is suddenly erupting into public consciousness because it's gotten very good at creating images based on text prompts or text descriptions. And it's also gotten very good at carrying on conversations to the point where it really feels like there's somebody there at the other end.
Yeah.
And the sorts of work that it is taking on is, in many cases, the sorts of work that people associate with, spiritual pursuits or creative pursuits. It's not this alienating labor that we wanted to give up. It's painting and writing poetry and writing screenplays and things. Whereas a lot of the alienating labor, robotics has not has not progressed as quickly as artificial intelligence, and humans are still needed to do a lot of physically demanding, dangerous, repetitive, and largely unsatisfying sorts of work. So, given your perspective, having watched these trends longer than I have, how is the future shaping up for you?
Well, it is very interesting and peculiar that the evolution of AI is focused on content rather than on production and work. And this is, I think, a reflection on where the money went. It went away from production technology. It went away from projects that are exterior. And all of this money started chasing the internet. Back during the late 90s when they had the big stock boom and everybody was minting billions of dollars out of nothing. So that's where capital went. Capital went inside into virtual space, as predicted by Baudrillard actually, and some other people, that material reality would be ignored. I mean, you could already see that in New York in the 1970s. But so it's kind of disastrous. I mean, it's interesting. The recent thing with the chatbot developed by Microsoft, where it became very emo. It became an angry, sad, weepy, abused feeling chatbot, which I think is so interesting, because what the bot must have been doing is scraping from online how humans think. And what emerged was this self-pitying, angry bot who wanted to be a real boy, just like Zuckerberg. So yeah, I mean, all that's strange and fascinating and kind of fun, but also, I mean, I would say it's the wrong direction for saving human beings and bringing about the kind of culture and kind of economic reality that we would want to exist in. But I mean, it's possibly too late. So at least we get to play with the AIs and the shards of a declining country and a declining civilization and a declining species. Sorry. Yeah, that's my uplifting message for the moment, but don't stop trying.
Absolutely, don't stop trying. And I'm somebody who had I allowed myself to get too focused on, tales of impending doom for too long. And I've swung too far in the other direction, but I don't have any use whatsoever for pessimistic talk anymore. And I don't really have any use for, antinatalism or misanthropic talking about humans are a plague on the planet. I'm just not interested in any of that stuff.
I never went for the anti-human talk, for sure. Yeah. And I think that the cyber culture of the 90s, technoculture of the 90s, the counterculture of the 60s and 70s was largely pro-human. I mean, there's always it was kind of bipolar. Mondo was bipolar. Mondo was kind of a shift between sort of nihilistic, what's the word I'm looking for, dystopian views and extremely utopian, optimistic views. And I mean, we had that right from the beginning, and it continued throughout. I mean, in our first issue, the cyberpunk issue of Mondo2000, which was mostly hailed and also critiqued from the left for being this kind of upbeat, utopian techno magazine. I mean, at the same time, we also had an interview with John Shirley and a pull quote in which he says that, wires are stuck in the pleasure center of your brain, and you just chuckle, and while they're vivisecting you and reel out a length of your intestines. So, I mean, Mondo was, the cyberpunk was fairly dark. Cyber culture was in some ways fairly bright. and there were those two wavering things going on all at the same time, and I was still there, projecting both the light and the dark today.
Parker in the chat writes, I remember buying a copy of Mondo2000 in 1992 or 1993. Magazines showed a whole different world for me. This was around the same time I bought the premiere issue of Wired magazine. And I'll just share my own personal history. I was in Japan when the first issue of Wired came out. I saw it on a shelf in a bookstore. I picked it up and I bought it. And for the price of buying one issue off the rack in Japan, I could subscribe for a whole year, even including, overseas shipping. So I took the mail-in card from that first issue and I subscribed, and I was a subscriber to Wired magazine, which it didn't occur to me until I was just reviewing, the timeline that Mondo2000 predates Wired magazine. You cover sort of the same scene, but from a very different perspective. I wonder if you could reflect on maybe the relationship or lack thereof. There may have been no relationship, but the comparison to Wired magazine, and also just the role that magazines used to play in our lives and don't really anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know which one to take on first. I mean, I just said on Twitter, good old Twitter, that I used to travel over 200 miles, I think, or over 190 miles sometimes from Binghamton, New York, where I lived, to New York City just to buy magazines. I would go to the East Village. I would buy Punk magazine. I would buy all these magazines. And there were pretty good magazine racks in Binghamton, but there were a few things like Punk and New York Rocker and stuff like that I craved. So, I mean, magazines were central to life. You could go to the 7-Eleven and buy High Times and the National Lampoon and Cream magazine. In the 1970s, you had a pretty vivid reflection of counterculture attitudes and tropes that now we just throw away on the internet, that we don't even have time to look at it. We just repeat the titles on Twitter, but never read them now, But at the time, magazines were super important. Mondo preceded Wired. I mean, there were two different types of relationships to Wired. One was a public relationship in which we ridiculed them as the monkeys, a corporate clone of Mondo2000 made safe for, the hoi polloi and for advertisers and so forth. And then there was the other level at which they had been showing us their mock-up of what they were going to do, and we were chatting with them, and it was all kind of buddy-buddy. And I mean, there was my personal feeling that it was pretty good, but also that it was definitely too corporate friendly for my taste. I remember there was some huge corporate online thing going on at that time. I can't even remember what it was, but the cover of Wired magazine had to ask if this company sucked or not. And then they had to ask if Newt Gingrich was a friend or an enemy. My attitude was not good towards Newt Gingrich. So, I mean, there was this distinction between Mondo sort of being left libertarian, left anarchist, and Wired being right libertarian and right anarchist. And there was an underlying, people didn't talk politics a lot in the 90s like they do now, but there was this underlying thing, this underlying tension. Doug Rushkoff has actually theorized that Wired existed, was created by the Global Business Network and Nicholas Negroponte to bring down Mondo2000, which I think Timothy Leary told some Wired magazine people at a sitting in a booth at some conference that the Wired was the CIA's answer to Mondo2000. I remain friends with Lewis and Jane and Kevin Kelly and all the people. I mean, I wrote for them within a year or two. So I was a traitor to the Mondo brand while I was still a representative of the Mondo brand. So, I mean, it's a complicated relationship, and they have a pretty good online site now. They have a pretty good British version of the magazine. The magazine itself seems to be dead. It's there's not much content to it anymore. There's not much point. And there are people who do magazines now, who do like real art magazines, like Document and stuff like that, really thick, maybe once a year or twice a year publications that seem to thrive. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people discovered us both at the same time. We were in decline internally by the time Wired was on the rise.
Well, talk about that. Talk about the winding down of Mondo 2000.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to say too much about it because, the people involved, there's a bit of it in the book, Mondo 2000. What was it? The Freaks in the Machine, Mondo 2000 in late 20th century technoculture. But, I mean, advertising was always a problem. There was an issue with paranoia that I won't pinpoint to any individual right now, which caused some harm. We were riding a great wave of publicity, and suddenly MTV was banned from the Mondo house. So there were a lot of complexities. And then showing up in Time magazine in 1993, Gibson said that's a sign of that's a signature of the end when you're on the cover of Time magazine. So who knows? Yeah. But it continued to publish about one issue a year after 1993, and they were all really good. And I participated in most of them. And finally, there was this famous location in Berkeley that was called the Mondo House. It was the neo-Gothic citadel high in the Berkeley Hills, as it was repeatedly called by various media organs. The media loves to steal phrases from one another and repeat them. But it really did look like the cover of a Blue Oyster Cult album. And, there were a lot of old 1950s classic cars sitting outside and stuff like that. Yeah. So what was I talking about?
Well, I had asked you to talk about the sort of unraveling of Mondo 2000.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want
I can tell that you're very sensitive to the, the other people involved, and you don't want to pick any fights or point any fingers. So I invite you to just talk about whatever you think is relevant, but also not going to, burn any bridges.
Well, I mean, in some ways, what Mondo was about declined as the internet rose. We were talking about a world that was coming, and now the world was there. And it was, in some ways, more beautiful in fantasy than it was in reality. So the reality of everybody getting online, it was sort of kludgy. It was, people weren't instantly becoming their own multimedia publishers, broadcasters, and so forth. Now here we are, we made it. One of the things that Mondo was about was that the means of communication was being given to everybody, and we are here now. So that happened, but it was happening slow at the time, and it was kind of the feeling that utopia wasn't arriving, on time. Kind of was a setback for the Mondo vision, but I mean, I don't know. I don't have a lot to say about that period of decline with Mondo. It was I wrote a bunch of books. I did the Cyberpunk Handbook with St. Jude, and How to Mutate and Take Over the World with St. Jude, which started out as a project to tell people to create a game that would end up being published with hackers telling people how to take over the world by hacking. And the other aspect of it was mutate, and transhumanists were going to tell us how to mutate. But nobody knew how to do any of those things. So it ended up being sort of a self-satire by myself and St. Jude, which the book was really loved by a handful of postmodern academics, but otherwise sort of died a poorly distributed death. It was also designed wrong. I mean, that period after Mondo was a period of difficulty for me personally, which makes it weird to talk about. I had a recording contract with Trent Reznor's Nothing Records, and a record that wasn't released, and there are all these kind of bitter things that aren't really particularly relevant to people right now. Although I will say that I have a great Mondo Vanilli project called I'm Against NFTs, which will be online on March 20th of this year, and will be a virtual reality created by GenieMo, some friends of ours from Great Britain. So, and I had a music project that didn't end up going forward in the way that it should have, thanks to contractual complications, and I guess Reznor not completely understanding the album I Owe You, Babe. So how's that for adding some confusion to the narrative?
Well, let's jump ahead out of the 90s and into the first decade of this century. I started podcasting in 2006, and I think you probably started pretty early as well. What's the story of your podcasting career from the aughts?
Yeah, I can't remember the exact dates, but I had the Are You Sirius show and Neophiles, and we had a lot of great guests. We had a crew of 3 people who would talk to each other about issues, and then we would get our guests on. And I mean, it was pretty popular, and it was tremendously fun. Who did we have on there? We had Richard Hell. We had the director, Richard Hell from Richard Hell and the Voidoids, early New York punk rocker. We had the director who did Slackers, Richard Linklater. I don't know. We had so many great people on there, and we would talk in a very loose-lipped way about culture and politics in ways that would probably get it canceled today, I would guess. That's another part of. That's another thing I try to evade to the degree that I can, the hypersensitivity of the moment. I'm a great supporter of the idea that there is a thing that we could call social justice, and that it does relate to race and gender and so forth. And then at the same time, wanting to wanting to transition into Tipper Gore and slap warning signs on the foreheads of comedians is not my idea of liberation. And I'm already wishing I hadn't said that. So that's the environment that we're in today.
If you look at the 1950s, the style of dress, the music that was popular is distinctly different from the 1960s. And then there's a clear evolution into the 70s, and then the 80s has its own vibe. And it seems like the 90s is sort of the last decade that really has a distinctive flavor. Like the aughts and the teens and now the 20s, we seem kind of culturally stagnant, even though, technology has changed a lot about how we relate to one another. It just doesn't seem like the last couple of decades have that same sort of unique character. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, actually, in my last editorial for Mondo in 1995, I think it was in 1995 or 1996, I declared an end to Zeitgeist. I said that Mondo had been a Zeitgeist magazine, but Zeitgeist had come to an end, and that Generation X had pretty much knocked it off with a big smirk and a giant, yeah, whatever, never mind. And by the time we get into the 21st century, I think, lost in cyberspace, pretty much where we are in terms of anybody trying to get a fix of what the culture is today. I mean, it's dispersed, and that was the intention. The intention was to decentralize culture. We called High Frontiers and then Reality Hackers and then Mondo2000 the be-ribbon letter bomb to the core address of consensus reality. So the intention was to explode consensus reality, and I have expressed limited regrets about doing that. On Doug Rushkoff's podcast, actually, I said, I'm sorry for exploding consensus reality. He said, it's your fault. I said, yeah, it's my fault. Not really, but this is what has taken place. I think reality is individualized. It's small group. It's what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, it's distributed, and there's not really an overall sense of where we are. I have the idea, which I'm giving away the end of my book, but I've already discussed this in public a number of times, that we already are in a singularity, in the sense that the science fiction writer, whose name is escaping me right now, who first described the singularity, said that a singularity was when AIs become smarter than human beings, and after that we can't predict what will happen or can't understand who we are. Werner Vinge is the name I was searching for. And my claim now is that we've already been through a singularity, and the singularity is billions of people getting online, and we can't understand the cognitive effects and the social effects and the political effects of what has happened to us after that happened, and we can't predict what will happen next, and we can't understand the neurological psychosis. And since you like to be positive, maybe some evolutionary thing that might come from it ultimately, we can't understand any of what that is. So that's another kind of singularity. I know a number of people have talked about social singularities, including Mark Healy, who brought the raves from Great Britain to San Francisco, but this is my version of it. I think it's pretty valid.
So Carrie Long in the comments writes, Mondo2000 was such a huge inspiration. I used to run this weird sci-fi cafe in Los Angeles that carried a torch for Mondo2000 style cyberculture. Timothy Leary joined us once for our Thursday night storytelling event. Of course, the theme that night was drug stories.
I remember being there, actually. I think during some kind of conference that was happening in Pasadena. I think there was a party there, and I was among the visitors. Whoever was out there could respond to that, but I think I remember being at their place.
It's funny, you've mentioned raves a few times. I remember hearing about raves when I was living in Missouri, and then I moved to Seattle, and I finally got to go to a rave. But by the time I got to one, I was 28 years old, and the oldest person there. And I thought, at the time I felt that I was too old, that I'd missed it.
Hey, I was 38 years old, 39 years old.
Yeah, so
even with ecstasy, I was going home at 4 a.m. There were some great troopers who would make it through the night. Yeah, it was an incredible intervention of psychedelia into modern culture that brought in a lot of young people. Yeah. We were sponsors of a number of raves. I don't even think we were asked necessarily. We just saw our name on the little things that would go around. Nah.
Well, I went to a few different raves, and some of them were, I would say, quite authentic. Very sort of seat of the pants, and others were very, very polished, organized business affairs, but with techno music and flashing lights and glow sticks and things. But it was quite a range of events that would fall under the title of rave in like the late 90s in the Seattle area.
Yeah. Well, everything becomes slick eventually. I think these times might be the decade of being slick. No matter how underground you try to be, you kind of try to be slick at the same time, I think, because we have the tools to make things look good. But fortunately, I'm a visual screw up. So when I do stuff by myself on my website, it looks pretty messy anyway, unless somebody comes along to help me.
Well, websites are kind of old news.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, everything is either a social media platform or it's an app on your phone. But the idea of going to a website is a little bit quaint these days.
Yeah, but people can come anyway. Mondo2000.com. It's there.
Still there. All right.
Yeah.
Well, what relationships from the period of Mondo 2000's its pinnacle still are important to you, in 2023?
You mean personal relationships or?
Well, take that any way you like, any way that provides an interesting answer.
Okay. Well, I'm certainly the relationship to tech culture is still important to me. I'm still fascinated by evolutions in robotics and what's going on online. And there is a new excitement now around artificial intelligence, around the blockchain. Our senior editor, St. Jude, was one of the people who introduced cypherpunk to the world. She named the cypherpunks, the first people to develop, what's the word I'm looking for?
Cryptography?
Cryptography, yeah. Well, they weren't the first people to develop cryptography, but to develop crypto cash and stuff like that. The notion of total anonymity at that time was associated with it, and total anonymity has proved to be a bit of a chimera as crypto capital has evolved. Various forms of crypto cash and NFTs and online trading has been gifted to us. It no longer has that pure anonymity. State actors and journalists and so forth can penetrate behind those curtains somewhat unpredictably, but nevertheless they can. So I'm interested in how those things evolved forward from the mid-90s when we knew all the cypherpunk people and their sort of anarcho-capitalist intentions, how it has come forward into this great, messy miasma of absolute confusion. And I do have this project, I'm Against NFTs, which is a song, and I'm not really against NFTs. I'm against NFTs, question mark, exclamation point, or period. Are actually, as the people who did the virtual reality for us framed it, are you against NFTs, question mark, exclamation point, period. So I'm fascinated by all that kind of stuff. I'm slow to figure it all out. In some ways, I don't even want to figure it out. In many ways, I feel like whatever is happening in crypto and the generation of NFTs and all that is really a reflection. It is very similar to what happened when in 2008, the online economy, the financialization of capitalism nearly crashed the entire world economy. I think it's still that same kind of fascination with peculiar forms of valuation that was predicted all the way back to Marcel Duchamp throwing out a urinal in an art gallery. If I might merge different cultural things at the same time, there's been this question of value and capital occurring throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, and it's now been thrown into perhaps another kind of singularity where we can't predict what it will mean tomorrow or in a few weeks or in a few years. I hope I'm not making sense, because it doesn't make sense to me either.
Well, I have been listening to people rhapsodize about the potential of the blockchain since like 2012 or so. And for many years, people who understood blockchain technology were very, very excited about it. And, they had this sort of mania about them. But, I couldn't really get from them a concrete example of how this thing would be used in a transformative way. And, other than just investing in Bitcoin and its copycats, nothing really caught on until the NFT craze. And then it seemed like the whole purpose of the NFT, the non-fungible token, was to create scarcity where none existed, to take something that could be copied infinitely, like a JPEG, and say, well, this is a particular instance of a JPEG that has this identity as an address on the blockchain. And if you want to have exclusive bragging rights to ownership of this particular instance of this JPEG, here's the address, pay some money, or, send us some Ethereum. And
the peculiar thing about it is, I hooked up as I was doing, as we did the song I'm Against NFT, Mondo2000, also with the punk rock singer blog Dahlia on some of the vocals. As we did that, I was going to offer it as an NFT, of course, because that's the trickster attitude. And I made contact with a lot of the people who really do NFTs well. And one of the things I discovered was that exclusivity isn't necessarily valued. I mean, even that is in a place of chaos. It's, well, maybe yes, maybe no, maybe you'll be offering people an exclusive to your song and maybe you won't. Valuation with NFTs and in this whole arena is even stranger than exclusivity. It's another lost in cyberspace kind of thing that you can't nail down, which is marvelously psychedelic, of course. The experience of psychedelia is that everything is a dance of atoms and nothing can be laid down. There are no solids, and there are no solid concepts or possibilities of ownership in cyberspace. So one possibility of the blockchain that I can think of is the idea that people have to supply their social security numbers to legitimize themselves with banks and businesses, and everybody's social security numbers have been hacked by 1 million hackers and the Russian mafia and the National Security Agency and the pimply little 18-year-old guy next door and whatever you can think of. And the blockchain might be a way in which we can legitimize ourselves without providing hackable data to anybody, and therefore secure whatever security might still be available for people's financial data while we're still playing, and that kind of arena before the breakdown of everything into something wonderful, remembering that you like to be optimistic.
Well, I don't want to be unreasonably optimistic.
Oh, do.
Yeah. I just don't have any use for, unhinged pessimism, because there's a lot of it. It's very, very seductive.
Yeah.
You've talked about, anonymity and the blockchain, and the idea that this is going to be some means by which people can transact with one another without the government being a party to it, that seems fanciful. I have, it's you have to provide a lot less information about yourself to open a bank account these days than you do to open an account on a lot of crypto exchanges. The know your customer regulations are really extreme. For one, I had to submit selfies of, my straight on face and a profile. I also had to take a picture of my driver's license and hold it up, and in the other hand, hold up a piece of paper with that day's date written on it, so that my ID, the date, and my face are all in one image, and I had to submit that.
But I didn't have to go that far. Yeah.
This was for a South Korean exchange called Hotbit.
Uh-huh.
And another one in Singapore that I have some interaction with, Cake app. They also had know your customer requirements that were way in excess of anything that I've ever had to produce, even to get like a passport.
Yeah.
So the idea that I'm anonymous to them is absurd.
Right. Well, the new idea is not anonymity, but trust. And I think that's also complicated as well. I know the ideology, the positive utopian ideology behind NFTs and the blockchain that they were developing communities of trust. I mean, this whole leaning on technology. I mean, Doug Rushkoff has really started to question it completely, and that your community of trust should be probably just in the flesh, get outside and see some people and trust them. And that the interfaces that we're using, including the blockchain, are not really the best way to form communities. Although I must say that I spend a lot of time in my home, so I kind of cure my own loneliness by being here, by being online, I just hate that Twitter is getting ruined. It was my favorite. I'm still there. Come and see me. 2000 _ Mondo.
That was Are You Sirius? And there is more to the conversation. It will conclude in the next episode of the C-Realm Vault podcast, which will be C-Realm Vault podcast episode number 451, which you can access via my Patreon. It's patreon.com/KMO. That podcast is not available yet. It will be in the next couple of days. All right. Well, I just re-listened to that conversation with Are You Sirius? Took some notes. There were things that I caught on the second time through that I didn't remember hearing the first time through, or didn't really focus on the first time through. The thing that stands out to me, just having re-listened to this conversation, or at least the first part of it, with Are You Sirius, is that Mondo2000 magazine, which in my mind is just, it's synonymous with the 90s, but really it's the early 90s, when I was in college and then later in grad school in Columbia, Missouri. Whereas Wired magazine didn't start until 1993. And here's something I remember about the early days of Wired magazine. I was online in the early 90s. I was online before there was a World Wide Web, which I know for some people today, that doesn't really even make sense. I mean, if there weren't web pages, if there weren't URLs, what does it mean to get online? Well, there were different ways. There were... Are You Sirius mentioned the Whole Earth Electronic Link. I was on that, but not an active participant, really. I don't think anybody would remember me or my participation from the well. But I was also on Lambda Moo. Moos and mushes. A mush was a multi-user simulated habitat, or a mud was a multi-user dungeon. These are all text-based, like massively multiplayer online worlds, but with no graphics. It's all just text-based. Did a lot of those. There was internet relay chat. I mentioned that in the conversation with Are You Sirius? But in those early days of the pre-web internet, there was a lot of excitement. But I was online in that period. Most people were not, but I was online because I was at a university. I didn't have a computer. I didn't own a computer, but I would go to a computer lab and I would check my email. And I would also, participate in Usenet news groups and, and the other methods that I mentioned. And so being online and being in communication with people that I only knew from online, I considered myself to be a pretty online person. But there was an early Wired magazine survey to figure out how online you were. And really what the thing was measuring was, how much money do you have? Because the most online person was the person who had a cell phone, back in those days when most people did not have mobile phones. Somebody who subscribed to cable TV. Basically, the more money you spent each month to communicate or to get content, the more online you were. And that, I remember, that offended a lot of people who, felt really invested in this emerging online space but didn't spend a lot of money on it because they were a university and it was free. But as Are You Sirius, lays out the timeline, the rise of Wired coincided with the decline of Mondo2000, and really the emergence of the online reality did not compare favorably with the exotic and romantic notions that people imagining the future were describing in the pages of Mondo2000 magazine. The emerging reality did not match or live up to the fantasy. And that was dispiriting to them. Whereas the folks at Wired, they were all about business. They were all about access. They were all about, being in the room with the big people, making the powerful big money decisions. And I know that's a very mercenary and sort of nihilistic description of Wired magazine. As I mentioned, I bought the first issue on a newsstand, in a bookstore in the magazine section in Japan. I spent like $30 for one issue of the magazine. But, having picked it up and flipped through it, I was just so excited by the subject matter and by, the writing that went into it. I was in Japan. I was working in Japan. I was making good money. $30 wasn't, even though it was 1993, that wasn't a lot of money for me. But again, I could subscribe for a year, even with the overseas postage, for less than that. So I did. And I stayed subscribed for many years. And, for me, Wired magazine was a window into that portion of the online world that I didn't really interact with. And it was also, like Mondo2000, a dream spinner. It was talking about things happening in the near future, things that were, projects that were already underway, but which hadn't come to fruition and which seemed really exciting. But as I mentioned, and as Are You Sirius mentioned, magazines used to be a much bigger deal than they are now. And I've just been thinking about the different magazines that really meant a lot to me in different periods of my life. And the very first magazine that I had multiple copies of, and that introduced me to the concept of one magazine which gets published again and again with different content, so there are different issues, was a magazine called Dynamite. And it was made for elementary school children, and I got it at school. We used to have these book ordering opportunities at school, and you could get magazines and posters and things like that. And I always got Dynamite magazine. I remember having multiple copies of them, and I remember being, a little kid, and like guests would come to our house, and without saying what I was doing and without mentioning it, I would just go and get 3 or 4 copies of Dynamite magazine and come and just like sit on the couch and read one and have the others sitting out just to show off. Look, I have multiple copies, multiple issues of a magazine. I thought that was pretty cool. Later, like in the 80s, the magazines that meant a lot to me, well, the two biggest probably were Heavy Metal magazine, which is not a music magazine. It was comics. It was the basis of the animated movie Heavy Metal and the various incarnations of it that came after, none of which were as good as the first one from, 82, I think. And then Marvel Comics, they had a line of creator-owned comics, like Spider-Man or Iron Man or, any of the famous Marvel characters. They're not owned by any one creator. They're owned by the corporation. And they pay different people to come in and write and illustrate stories with these characters. But the people doing the writing, they don't own the characters. But, those same writers did have their own projects, their own ideas, their own characters, their own stories. And they didn't really have the opportunity to publish those stories until Epic Comics, the line, the sort of branch, like specialty line of comics from Marvel Comics came out. And there was also a big glossy magazine, very much like Heavy Metal, that had a lot of adult-themed, lavishly illustrated stories in it. And that was called Epic Magazine. And Heavy Metal and Epic were epic to me. They really, they fueled my dreams. They fueled my artistic ambitions. And then also in the 80s, magazines that meant a lot to me were like fitness magazines, Muscle and Fitness, Flex, things like this. The Joe Weider line of magazines and bodybuilding products and the bodybuilding lifestyle of the late 80s. I was into it. Of course, even before any of that, I guess around the same time that I was into Dynamite magazine, I learned of such things as Playboy magazine and Penthouse magazine. And in the 70s and the 80s, particularly the early 80s, that was pornography. I mean, yeah, there was, like in the mid 80s and afterwards, you did have porn videos on VHS, but I didn't have a VHS player. And even when I got one, it was in the living room of my mother's house. I couldn't really watch porn there. So, it was magazines. Magazines were the vector for pornography from my preteen or even my, elementary school days. Because, big shock, folks, even young boys who haven't been through puberty yet are still obsessed with sex. And back in the day, catching a glimpse of a naked woman was not easily done. And when it was done, it was usually on the pages of a magazine like Playboy. Later, around the same time I was reading Mondo2000, there was a magazine. I mean, it was running throughout the 80s. It was called Omni, and it was a mixture of science fantasy, science fact. It was pretty fluffy, not really scientifically rigorous most of the time. But, it was a stimulus to the imagination again. And then Bob Guccione, the publisher of Penthouse magazine, he bought Omni, or he somehow, maybe he owned it the whole time, but there was a time in the 90s when it was very clear that Penthouse and Omni were owned and published by the same group because they looked very similar. Like they had the same fonts, the same page layout templates. You could tell these were two instantiations of the same project. And then later, I discovered other types of magazines, film magazines. And science fiction magazines. I used to read Starlog quite a bit. And then there was a whole host of magazines devoted to gory films, like splatter magazines, things like, Fangoria, I guess, was the granddaddy of that genre. But, Are You Serious mentioned driving a long way to go to New York City to buy magazines. And I remember, I've always had family in New York City, so I've been going there since I was a child. And I remember in my teens discovering that there were magazines that I could get in New York City that were not available in Kansas City, Missouri, which was where I was living at the time. One of those was called Film Threat, and it was about small independent films or horror films, or, it was just films that were off the beaten track. And Chris Gore, I think, is the name of the publisher. I now see him on YouTube all the time. It's kind of like YouTube has taken the place of magazines. The magazine publishers, the renegade sort of underground rebel magazine publishers of the 80s and 90s have YouTube channels now, as do I. Another magazine in the same vein, for me anyway, as Omni and Mondo2000 and Wired was the Whole Earth Review. I think Are You Serious mentioned Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Catalog a couple times, but there was, I think it was a quarterly magazine called Whole Earth Review, and it featured a lot of stories about science fiction, speculative futurism, that sort of thing. And like Mondo2000, it had a very advanced sort of arty, you might say, design sensibility. And also very important, in terms of print was the letters pages of different magazines and also different comic books. Like I had I wrote a letter to the publisher of Sandman, DC Comics, which got printed. It got printed in a edited version. It was a shorter version on the page than, what I sent them. And also, the opportunity to have your letter published in Cerebus. Cerebus was a independent black and white comic by a guy named Dave Sim, who is thoroughly canceled now for being anti-feminist. But for a time, that was one of these smarter comic books available at the comic book store. And, the people who were writing in were writing high quality content. So the letters page of Cerebus was kind of an event. It was a thing, And now all of that is just gone. What remains of magazines? I mean, the only magazine I subscribe to now is Foreign Affairs. And I just do it because it's cheap. And because I like to read on paper sometimes, where I can highlight and make notes in the margins and whatnot. And it persists, it sits. It's an object sitting in my living space that I glance repeatedly and, I spot it repeatedly over the course of the day. And the web's just not like that. The web's in my phone and it's always with me and it's, it's expansive and everything you want is there pretty much, but it's not a replacement for magazines. And, I know magazines still exist. You might have one in view right now, but they don't occupy the same space in our heads, in our imaginations, in our lives, in our social interactions that they used to. And I miss them. All right, now back to Bard. Bard's a funny name for me for this thing because The early days of podcasts for me, the defining show, like the light in the darkness, was the Psychedelic Salon podcast. And, the light within the light was Terence McKenna, somebody who I had encountered in the pages of Mondo2000 magazine in the 90s. But Terence is often referred to as the Bard. And Bard is the name of Google's large language model, interface for search. And so I asked Bard, describe the impact of the reduced role that magazines play in daily life in the 21st century. And Bard responded, the reduced role that magazines play in daily life in the 21st century is due to a number of factors, including the rise of the internet, the decline of print media, and the changing way people consume news and entertainment. The internet has made it possible for humans to access information from a variety of sources, including magazines, newspapers, and websites. This has led to a decline in the number of people who read magazines on a regular basis. The decline of print media has also contributed to the reduced role of magazines. Newspapers and magazines are facing increasing competition from online sources, and many publications have been forced to reduce their print runs or even shut down altogether. The changing way people consume news and entertainment has also had an impact on the role of magazines. People are increasingly getting their news and entertainment from social media, streaming services, and other online sources. This has made it more difficult for magazines to compete for attention. Despite these challenges, magazines continue to play an important role in daily life. They provide in-depth coverage of topics that are not always covered by other media outlets. They also offer a unique perspective on the world that can be both entertaining and informative. And then, of course, you got to do a vanity search, right? So I asked Bard, what do you know about the C-Realm podcast? And it's funny because it gave me 3 paragraphs. First paragraph. The C-Realm podcast is a weekly, interview-based program featuring discussions on topics ranging from a possible technological singularity to entheogenic exploration, the relocalization of community and agriculture, and the competing narratives by which we define ourselves and navigate our world. It is hosted by KMO, who has been podcasting since 2006. I laugh because I'm pretty sure I wrote that. I think Bard just went out into the internet, and the first thing it found is something that I wrote. Second paragraph is much shorter. The podcast has been praised for its in-depth interviews and its wide range of topics. It has also been criticized for its length and its sometimes esoteric content. That's odd. I didn't write that. I don't know where that comes from. I guess it comes from awarenessproject.org/podcasts, which is one of only 2 sources listed here. The other one being podcasts.apple.com/us/podcast/CRealm. So, criticized for its length. That's interesting. The podcast has always been about an hour, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, maybe as long as 90 minutes, but I guess those criticisms came before Joe Rogan, where the 3.5, 4-hour podcast became quite mainstream. And then the third and final paragraph. The C-Realm podcast is a valuable resource for anyone interested in exploring the intersection of technology, culture, and the human condition. It is a podcast that will make you think, and it is a podcast that will challenge you. Now, that's obviously very complimentary, and I didn't write it. I don't recognize it. I'm guessing that came from a listener. So whoever wrote that, thank you. And thank you to Bard for bringing it to my attention. All right, I'm going to leave it there. As always, if you have feedback, I guess the best way to get it to me is to either go to patreon.com/KMO and find the entry for this episode. It will always be free. It will not be paywalled. You don't have to support me on Patreon to access it, but you can leave a message there. All of these podcasts also get put up on YouTube, and in fact, more people access them via YouTube than they do via all the podcast platforms combined. So finding this episode on YouTube and commenting there might be the way to go. I used to give out my email and encourage people to write to me there. My email inbox is so full of junk now, it's really easy for me to miss important emails. So yeah, that's not the way to go anymore. Probably YouTube. YouTube's going to be your best bet. All right. As I mentioned, the conversation with Ken Goffman, aka Are You Sirius, will continue on the next episode of the C-Realm Vault podcast. And we start to get into culture war clashes there. Are You Sirius lives in California. He's been a part of the hippie scene since the 60s. He's definitely, not a Republican by any stretch. And even people who can kind of hang with old school Republicans are, they're just allergic to Trump. And so I've noticed that, when I'm talking to certain people, they'll throw out really, kind of hyperbolic criticisms of Donald Trump as a sort of test to see if you are, simpatico with them on a cultural or ideological level. And I'm not. I didn't vote for the guy. I don't like to listen to him. I find his personality, odious, but I don't think he's the devil. I don't think he's Hitler. I don't think he's, any sort of authoritarian. And in fact, in terms of his policies, I like the fact that he didn't start a lot of new wars. Or any. I think we dodged a bullet in 2016. Anyway, if that sets you off, you know how to contact me. All right, I'm out. Thanks for listening. Talk to you again in 1 week's time. Stay well.